Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our weekly webinar and podcast. Today, we're going to continue on with major market locations that have lots and lots of people who ask us all the time, well, tell us, how's it going there? What's going on? Last week, we looked at Seattle, or Greater Seattle. Today, we're going to look at New York City, which is almost impossible to cover in the amount of time we've got. Now, let me just say this at the outset. I'm going to show you how to look at New York City. I'm not going to tell you exactly where to go because there's just too many people there, too many potential areas, and they're remarkably different from each other. So just be aware that what I'm going to talk about is how to look at it. And I'd like you to keep this in mind if you ever think about going to the Big Apple. I have a kind of a love and an affinity for the place. I think it's a great place. Unfortunately, there's some real pits that you can easily find yourself in, and I've got a lot of people who tell me about their regrets of moving there. So other little thing, let me start off with this. If you've never lived in New York City, I don't recommend you start practicing there. And I'm talking about live there as in not just going to medical school or dental school. I mean, if you happen to know the area, that's terrific. Trying to go in cold, however, this is a very challenging place. I've lived in New York City, by the way, in Queens and Manhattan and in Brooklyn. So I know the place a little bit. I've been everywhere else. So let's just kind of jump into this whole program today on practicing in New York City. And as I said, forgive me if I go just a little long, but this is detailed and I think it's going to be worth reviewing with everybody. Okay. So, as you know, there are 5 boroughs, and the boroughs are set up almost like counties in New York. Each one of these are actually part of New York City, but each one has their own government management. So each borough has its own borough administration. And within each borough, as we'll talk about, there are many, many different types of locations to consider going to. Obviously, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Manhattan, but we're also going to be talking about Long Island. The reason is Long Island is considered kind of part of New York City, but it is not really part of it in terms of its administration, but in terms of the market, it is. Now, what I want you to look at on this slide is you'll notice almost in the center of it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then Long Island is made up of 2 other counties, Nassau and Suffolk. Those 2 counties in Long Island are very different from each other. But what's weird about it is the rail system, subways, connect almost all of these together. The problem is it takes a very long time to get from one place to another. So you may say, well, why don't you go into Orange and Dutchess County and tell us about that, or Sussex? Guys, I have to do that if we're going to be looking at upstate New York or New Jersey. And that's where we'll go through those. Now, let's just make sure you understand what I was saying. In each of these boroughs, there are different neighborhoods or sections. Each section is actually made up of several practice areas, many of them, in fact. But the demographic character of each of these sub-cities within each borough is different. So, example, the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side that are on either side of Central Park in Manhattan are just not like each other, even though geographically they're not that far away. You got places like Gramercy and Chelsea and Chinatown, which are down in the south part of it, Manhattan. It's very different. And when we start getting into Brooklyn and Queens, it's even more of a nightmare. So let's talk about that. One of the things I want you to understand about New York City is when people are considering where to put a practice, where to purchase, you're always at the mercy of the public transportation system or the subway. Now, the subway obviously is important, just like the surface streets above are important. And to know where they are going and where they're coming from matters. But as important as the right of way, you also have to know which stop there is. Because a practice that is too far from one stop will actually be way outside of a practice. So even though geographically it looks like it's close, it isn't. And it isn't close, not just distance-wise, but in the minds of the people who are here. So if we look at any of the lines, and these colors, as you all know, go through and have certain places they will mix. So Herald Square and oh gosh, Astor Place and some of these others, you have to kind of know where they're related to each other. Knowing where the stops are in relation to the other lines matters, especially because in New York right now, we're finding a lot of times the lines aren't open all the time, or they'll have a slowdown, which they often announce, but it makes it very difficult for people to try to make their appointments. You have to understand you're going to have a lot of people who are late if they're dependent upon public transportation, or they've got to pass through Grand Central or Union Square or whatever. If there's a closure or a delay as running a practice, you got to know. Now, some people will ask, Scott, where's the money? Well, there's very rich places, there's very poor places. And what's kind of ironic, even if we look at Manhattan here, in that south part of it in Midtown, there's a lot of money. But people don't necessarily consider themselves rich because the cost of living is very high. And with that, even though people may make $200,000 a year, they may just kind of be scraping by. So whenever I'm looking at a location, I try to consider not just what the amount of money that people are making who are working or living in an area. I also try to figure out the ratio of cost of living per household. That will make it so that you kind of go, wow, I understand now why some people may not love this particular area, or they may be thinking it's the best place on earth. Now, I want to talk to you about the two parts, the Nassau County and Suffolk County and Long Island. Yes, they're right up against Brooklyn and Queens, but mentally, when you pass into Nassau County, it's a different place. The same thing is true as you go from Nassau County into Suffolk County. The other thing a lot of people aren't aware of is on the north side of Long Island versus the south side, and even right in the middle where the railroad runs, guys, that is a different world. So even though distance may not be that great, time and mentality make it that you have to understand why one place is different from another. In my humble opinion, Long Island should be divided much further into smaller units even, not because of its population, but because of how long it takes to get from one place to another. Median household income in Suffolk County, this kind of just shows you where the red area is, where there's relative poverty. The blue is where there's relative wealth. But this can also be very deceptive because the north side and the south side, the cost of living is quite different. By the way, this is the best map I could find for, and it comes from 1990. The numbers haven't really changed that much. Now, here's a couple of other things I want you to understand about New York City in practice. How do I say this in a really nice way? Look, New York City has a lot of people, obviously. It's a very dense population, but it's not evenly distributed. So if you look at Brooklyn, which has the largest population, it isn't the most densely populated. However, it's one of the most diverse populated places. If you go to Manhattan, which is not one of the biggest, it is still a place where a vast, huge number of people work. When we look at the amount of growth that is going on, and these are 5-year things from 2010 to 2015, what you're going to notice is the amount of growth and the amount of money that is, as we'll look at other statistics, really is very humble. There is not a lot of new housing going on in New York City. Now, this is a little bit different when you talk about Long Island because there are new projects there because there's more open space, but not a lot. And what you're going to find is some people will say, well, it's too crowded here. There's already people. The thing I'm trying to make mention of is the biggest thing they've got in New York City is churning. Yes, there are people who own their homes, but there is more turnover in New York City than almost anywhere on the face of the earth. Meaning people will move in, they'll live for 2 or 3 years, and then they're gone. And that is what they refer to as getting your ticket punched mentally. The same thing happens in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., the D.C. area, very much. People don't stay for a tremendously long period of time. So even though the amount of growth in terms of raw numbers doesn't appear that great, there's a lot of variety going on here. Let me keep going through, because this is something that I always find funny. People will say, well, tell me about how the growth is going in New York. Well, births, believe it or not, there's actually quite a number of births, moderately high, that are going on in each of the boroughs. If you look at the Brooklyn area, births are greater than they're going to be in, say, Manhattan, and definitely bigger than Staten Island. But a lot of people are talking about, yeah, but I heard there are people leaving New York City. And yes, there are a lot of people leaving New York City. One of the weird things is, if you look about where people are coming from, international migration into New York City is huge. A lot of people are moving in. But the people who are native people that have been there for a while, they're getting out of town. And that's because there are other options for people when they're considering New York City. Where are they moving? Florida, Georgia, Alabama, South and North Carolina. They're getting out of here. Even some people are moving down to Virginia, but for the most part, the direction that they're traveling is to Florida. So when we look at domestic migration, they're losing a lot of people. When it comes to net international immigration, they're growing much more, but they're not growing evenly. If you'll notice, by the way, Queens has got a lot of people who are international migrants moving in. Brooklyn has a lot of domestic people leaving. Now, I don't want to go into specifically why, but even though this is true of the borough, if you look at each neighborhood, it's a different story. So there are parts of Brooklyn that are growing pretty well and other parts of Queens that are kind of dying. But you have to understand that for the borough itself, there are a lot of people moving, and they're moving for the same reasons. Now, I thought you'd like to see what the income maps are showing. This is a very complex situation. A particular note, I want you to look at Manhattan, which, in case you're missing it, is that little peninsula that's up on the north side. Central Park is gray because nobody lives in Central Park, theoretically. You'll notice on the south side, there's just an awful lot of people with big money, but it's also some of the most expensive real estate and leases that there are in the country. So what people have done is they'll find a way to move to Manhattan to work. Once they get their job, they'll move away, particularly after they get married. And believe me, you don't want to try raising a kid in Manhattan. It's expensive, a little scary too. So moving on, I'm sorry if I'm just clicking through this a lot, but when you're ready to learn about a specific part of the area, it's time for us to talk about specifics. Now, as you'll note, Suffolk County, which is in the middle, is not showing a tremendous amount of growth by percentage, even though there's a very big population there. Queens, on the other hand, if you're really thinking, where should I go? Where should I look? I'd say Queens and Brooklyn are the places right now that I'm favoring most. I'm not favoring Staten Island for most of it. That doesn't mean the island is dead. It is not. But I'm just saying, if you really want to go for a place that's going to show you the most likelihood of success, especially if there's any chance of startup, Queens is a good place to consider. Kings County, pretty darn good. Now, without belaboring this, as I mentioned, Suffolk County has money. So does Nassau County. This is Long Island. And you'll also note, by the way, these are places that have the highest age. So traditionally, when people get married, they want to have a house, and where they'll go is to Long Island or over into New Jersey. If the transportation access into New York City was better, I think this would actually change and there'd be more opportunities. But right now, public transportation within New York is bad. So what people are saying, the subway lines are kind of looking sort of scummy and kind of scary. And that's because the mayor and the city council, they don't really want to do anything to clean that up for political reasons, at least not between now and the election. Don't get me started, but New York politics are not like anywhere else on earth. Okay. I wanted to show you a little statistic that I've gathered that I thought you might find useful. This shows the population, veterinarians, dentists, and optometrists. Now, what you'll note is there are a disproportionately large number of certain professions in certain places than there are in others. So as you'll note, veterinarians in Nassau County, there's a lot of them. But you'll also note there are a lot of dentists, particularly in New York City, in New York itself. And it doesn't relate to what's going on in Queens. Veterinarians in Queens are actually, there are fewer because people will take their pet companions to another location. The same thing is true with optometrists, which are highly prone to be close to work. So what makes a place good for a veterinarian or a dentist or an optometrist or some other medical healthcare professional is that you have to recognize the reason people go to these professionals isn't the same for each kind of profession. If you will look at dentists, for example, there's an entirely different calculation you have to make for orthodontists, oral surgeons, endodontists, general dentists. And for that reason, you'll find a lot larger number of people in each of the professions and specialties in each of the areas. And it's always related to the lifestyles of the people. Now, those who have single family dwellings are much more inclined to have more pets. Therefore, they're the ones who are going to want to go to the veterinarian more often. If you happen to have a bird, I hate to say it, a lot of people don't take their birds to the veterinarian very often. On the other hand, orthodontists are much more inclined to serve adolescents. Oral and maxillofacial surgeons are going to serve either the older people with dental implants or extractions with the teen and 20 population. I'm just saying we have to take that into account more in New York City than anywhere else, but we still have to look at that everywhere we look. Now, one last little thing I thought I'd throw out to you is the ethnic breakdown is really weird in New York City. And I'm saying that because the Polish population is right near the Filipino population. And why is that? I don't know. I have no idea why certain people will show up. If you look at Flushing, you get a large number of Asians. And when you go, why? I don't know. But I do know that you have to know not just race, but you really have to know nation of origin. Because as we're looking at New York City with all that international migration, where there's a lot of one particular nation of origin, there's going to be a lot more because that's the nature of the immigrant population. So you want to go to New York City, you have to know who you want to serve. You also have to understand language distribution is really important, but also is family type. Now, you'll notice down in Brooklyn, there's a Yiddish population. That Yiddish population has been there for a very long time and isn't likely to change, but they are shifting within as to what part of one particular congregation or temple is going to be drawing most heavily from another. And therefore, if you happen to be wanting to serve the Yiddish population, you can't just say, well, I'm Jewish, I'm going to handle those people. You have to understand what the cultural identity of each of these groups is. So going back into this, just recognize it's a complex situation. It's a very dynamic and exciting thing. But one thing you have to understand, New York is changing, not only with the people leaving, but also the people coming. One of the reasons why New York City is growing remarkably quickly is because Europe is not doing well, and they're getting a lot of people from Europe. South Americans are also moving to New York City. Not as many Mexicans as Argentinians, Brazilians, and others from South America. It's also true that Asians are finding a way to go to New York City, but they're not just Asian like a big thing. It's a separate language group and nation of origin. Therefore, Cantonese and Mandarin, you got to know the difference between what neighborhood is going to be dominated by one or the other. Now, I'm going to kind of run through these really quickly. Well, I'm just going to jump through it. Let me just say, guys, when you want to know about New York City, where to go and what to do when you get there, we can help you. But I have to warn you against one quick thing. Do not assume that somebody with a real estate database of demographics is going to be able to help you, because they'll come up with a list of where the distribution of dentists or physicians are. They will not tell you what type they are, nor will they tell you what population they're serving. We do. So if you happen to be trying to find a Cantonese population versus a Mandarin population, come to us. We can help you with that. Mike, take it away.
So, I think your point was well made in that New York is one of those places, and not the only place, by the way, but certainly one of those places that insider knowledge is very well could be the difference between success or failure. I mean, it just is one
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
spots that has so many dynamics going for it. It's very different than much of the rest of the country, where you need to know a few things, a few factors, and then you can be successful. With New York, there's so much complexity happening in and out, both on the practice placement side, the market that you're going to be serving, and the way that you present your business or practice to the neighborhood. And even with that, like you said, New York doesn't really follow a lot of the rules that the rest of the country has in racial segregation. In that you have two different nationalities, two different peoples with wildly different ways that they living right next to each other. And so it creates a marketing challenge, frankly, of how you reach the people in a successful way and doing it in the way that you're going to have success consistently. And that's really kind of the key part. And what I want to touch on just for a minute today is finding that ability that you can leverage something such as your community to help you market. Because the one thing that you'll notice when you go to an area like New York is very often you have other businesses that in most cases have nothing to do with, if you're a dentist there, they have nothing to do with dentistry, or if you're an optometrist or a vet, they're not necessarily complementary in that, or a competition. They're complementary, meaning that it may be a grocery store, or it might be an attorney, or it could be a tax person. It could be a lot of different things that maybe they have been there for a very long time. This is particularly true if you're a startup, because when you're starting from scratch and you didn't purchase a practice, you are in a situation where you have to figure out all of these complexities in these neighborhoods. And if you can hitch your wagon to a company or an organization that already has some of those things figured out for your particular neighborhood, oftentimes you can create a really good situation. So I put this little presentation together partially because I knew we were going to talk about New York City. And let me give you an example of how, it has nothing to do with the world of professional practice, but is a good example of how this worked. So years ago, this seems like a lifetime ago because of so much has changed, but years ago, you had Nike and Apple that were both trying to launch products. You had Apple, who the iPhone had just come out, and they were really trying to dominate and create, and as we know, 10 years later that they were successful, but they were really trying to create a situation where they owned this market. As well as at the time, if I can bring you back, the iPod was the thing, and they were trying to find a way to break into this athletics, runners, that cult of personality, to be able to sell their products to. Now, on the flip side, Nike, who is the biggest name in athletics, they were wanting to promote their product to the tech crowd. They wanted to capture that market, and they wanted to understand that, but they know how to make apparel and shoes. They don't necessarily know much about technology. And so, bottom line, they needed each other's networks, they needed each other's buyers, and they needed each other's communities in order to make their products reach new heights. Now, what they did was they both invested in each other's businesses, and frankly, they both had a very massive return that came. And again, we're seeing this 10 years later, and we can see now how much technology has integrated in with apparel and shoes and watches and all of those things. And on the flip side, we see how much technology has gained by integrated into that apparel market. So again, that's a great example of how this was done successfully. Now, you may be thinking, well, this has nothing to do with my practice, but it actually, from a marketing sense, has everything to do with your practice, because you have to have the mindset is in that it does take a village for you to be successful, especially in an area like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and a lot of those other bigger cities with metro areas. They are very community minded, meaning that in much of the country, people will drive to go to Walmart or Sam's Club or Costco. In New York City, they will go to the neighborhood fruit stand. They will go to the neighborhood deli. They'll go to some of these places, and they just live a little differently. And so let me run through this scenario with you so you can kind of see how maybe this may jog your thoughts of how you can be successful. The first one is, do I support the team? Do you support that neighborhood that you're serving in? In an area, especially in a metro spot, they will know if you're an outsider. They know if you don't fit in the mold of who they are. This is an area that is very aware of outsiders and wary of outsiders, frankly. And so that is something you've got to see is, do you truly understand and have you truly invested in the psychographic nature and the psychographic tendencies of the neighborhood that you are treating and serving? This is true for almost every metro area in this country. The second thing is, do you rally around the cause? Can you get the feel for the culture of the area, and do you buy into that culture? And that could be religious, that could be political, that could be sports. The neighborhood football team, like I've got an example here, could be a lot of different things, but do you rally around that cause? And if you do, are you open to co-marketing with complementary businesses? Do you have the neighborhood deli's phone number? Have you gone down to meet them? Have you gone to, are you supporting them and doing co-events together so that you can be introduced to their market and you're willing to introduce them to yours? When you have that mindset, of that community mindset, you'll find much more success in the long term, and you'll find a lot more loyalty, frankly. And in these areas, that's very important. One thing you can do is you can hold special events. You can, another example is you can join neighborhood business networks. Now, most cases, I'm not a huge fan of these business networks, BNI, some of these others. But in an area like a downtown metro area, much like New York City, it can be absolutely invaluable for you being introduced to those good old boy services, right? Good old boy isn't just for Redneck USA. Good old boy is sometimes downtown New York City, where it is that tight-knit group and everybody wants to be treated or do business with a friend. And so you have to be measuring your returns and always looking for opportunities to invest your resources and time into the community that you're treating. Now, how are you going to understand that? The biggest thing that you've got to understand, and we preach this every single week, is understanding the psychographics of your community, understanding the dynamics, the demographics, the trends, and the things that are happening in the community that you're treating. Where can you find that? Of course, it's drdemographics.com. We have a variety of different reports and resources that you can draw upon to find out that critical information so you can make better decisions for your business. Now, if you have a specific marketing question or I'm not sure how to utilize the information we've provided, you can reach out to me at mike@drdemographics.com. And I'd be happy to spend a few minutes with you to kind of give you a little bit of guidance and show you exactly what you need to do for your practice to truly create a scenario where you can find long-term success. Okay, how did I do, Scott, on timing?
It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Timing was good too. But, Good stuff, Mike. You know, we ought to be charging a lot more than
We should. We really ought
that's
to.
what I'm thinking, you know. I've got kids in college, and you, on the other hand, are just kind of starting that whole thing.
Yeah, just on the brink.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We look forward to hearing from you. Give us a call if we can make your life any better and easier. And contact us at drdemographics.com. And thanks, Mike. You did a good job. We'll talk to y'all later.